Meet King John I of England, affectionately nicknamed Lackland, because apparently medieval parents believed in brutal honesty when it came to inheritance. Born in 1166, Johnny was the youngest son of Henry II, which in royal terms meant he was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. While his brothers got actual territories to rule, John got the equivalent of a participation trophy and a pat on the head. Picture this. You're born into the most powerful family in Europe, but you're basically the medieval equivalent of that friend who always gets picked last for dodgeball. John's father had carved up an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, but when it came time to distribute the goods, little Johnny got zilch. His brothers Richard and Geoffrey got duchies and counties, while John got to practice his signature and dream of better days. The nickname, Lackland, wasn't just cruel, it was prophetic. In an age where land equaled power, respect, and the ability to feed yourself without begging, having no territory was like showing up to a medieval potluck empty-handed. John spent his early years watching his brothers play with their shiny new kingdoms while he sat in the corner, probably developing the trust issues that would later define his reign. But here's where it gets interesting. Being the spare heir in a family of ambitious psychopaths wasn't exactly a recipe for mental stability. John grew up watching his brothers stab each other in the back, sometimes literally, for scraps of territory. This was a family where sibling rivalry involved actual armies and the occasional poisoning. Christmas dinner must have been absolutely delightful. By the time John reached adulthood, he learned that in the royal family business, nice guys finish dead. His father Henry II had spent decades fighting his own sons. His mother Eleanor was basically a medieval mastermind, and his brother Richard was off playing crusader superhero in the Holy Land. John was left to navigate this dysfunction while simultaneously plotting his own rise to power. The irony is delicious. The kid who got nothing for being born last would eventually inherit everything through sheer survival instinct. But as we'll see, getting the crown and keeping it are two entirely different skill sets. John was about to discover that ruling an empire is significantly harder than complaining about not having one, especially when your subjects think you're about as legitimate as a $3 bill. So how exactly does a landless prince become king? Well, in John's case, it involved waiting for his brothers to conveniently die off like characters in a medieval Game of Thrones episode. His older brother Henry died young, probably from eating something sketchy in 1183. Geoffrey got trampled by horses in 1186 during a tournament, because apparently medieval sports were basically organized attempts at accidental murder. That left Richard the Lionheart, who was too busy playing crusader celebrity in the Middle East to worry about boring stuff like actually governing England. Richard spent exactly 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, treating the kingdom like his personal ATM to fund his holy war vacation. He literally sold governmental positions, castles, and probably his mother's jewelry to finance his crusading adventures. When Richard finally got himself killed by a crossbow bolt in 1199 while besieging a castle over a trivial dispute, John probably did a little happy dance. But here's the medieval plot twist. John wasn't even Richard's obvious heir. His deceased brother Geoffrey had left behind a son, Arthur of Brittany, who had an arguably better claim to the throne. This was like inheriting your grandfather's fortune while your cousin waves around what might be a more recent will. John's solution to this succession crisis was elegantly medieval. He simply declared himself king faster than anyone else could object. Speed was everything in royal politics, possession being 9/10 of the law, and all that. He grabbed the crown jewels, got himself crowned, and then spent the next few years playing deadly hide-and-seek with his teenage nephew Arthur, who kept inconveniently insisting he was the rightful king. The whole Arthur situation reads like a medieval thriller novel. John captured his nephew in 1202, and then, well, Arthur mysteriously disappeared forever. Historians still debate whether John personally murdered the kid, had him assassinated, or simply locked him up until he died of natural causes. Either way, it's the kind of family problem solving that would make modern therapy sessions particularly awkward. But even with Arthur out of the picture, John's coronation was basically the medieval equivalent of a hostile corporate takeover. The English barons weren't exactly thrilled about their new king. The French were actively trying to steal his continental territories, and the Pope was already eyeing him suspiciously. John had finally gotten his crown, but it was starting to feel more like a very expensive target on his head. Now that John was officially king, he had to deal with the minor inconvenience of actually ruling an empire that stretched across 2 countries and multiple time zones. His inheritance included England, Normandy, Anjou, and chunks of western France, basically half of medieval Europe. Unfortunately, John approached international diplomacy with all the finesse of a bull in a china shop during an earthquake. His first major mistake was picking a fight with Philip Augustus of France, who was basically the medieval equivalent of that neighbor who's always looking for an excuse to steal your lawnmower. Philip had been chipping away at English territories for years, and John's arrival on the throne was like Christmas morning for French territorial ambitions. The French king took one look at John and probably thought, "Finally, an opponent I can actually beat." John's military strategy could generously be described as creative and more accurately as completely insane. He had this delightful habit of starting wars he couldn't finish, making alliances with people who hated him, and generally treating warfare like a particularly violent game of chess where he'd forgotten how the pieces moved. His campaigns in France became legendary for all the wrong reasons. The Battle of Bouvines in 1214 was John's masterpiece of military incompetence. He assembled this massive coalition against Philip Augustus, think medieval Avengers, but with significantly worse coordination. John managed to turn what should have been a crushing victory into a spectacular defeat that basically ended English power in northern France. It was like watching someone fumble a touchdown pass in the Super Bowl, except with actual kingdoms at stake. But here's where John really showed his genius for making enemies. He didn't just lose battles, he lost them expensively. Medieval warfare was basically crowdfunded by your own nobles. And John had this amazing talent for demanding huge sums of money to fund military campaigns that would inevitably end in humiliating defeat. His barons were essentially paying premium prices to watch their king get his ass kicked in France. By 1204, John had lost Normandy, Anjou, and most of his French territories, basically everything his family had spent generations building. He went from ruling an empire to governing what was essentially medieval England plus. The man who started with nothing had managed to lose almost everything, which takes a special kind of consistent incompetence that's almost admirable in its thoroughness. Having successfully alienated the French and most of his own nobles, John decided what his reign really needed was a good old-fashioned religious crisis. Enter Pope Innocent III, who was about as innocent as a medieval mob boss and twice as vindictive. The conflict started over who got to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury, basically a medieval HR dispute that escalated into international warfare. John's approach to papal politics was characteristically subtle. He told the Pope to mind his own business and appointed his own archbishop anyway. This was roughly equivalent to telling your boss's boss that you're going to promote yourself, and there's nothing they can do about it. Pope Innocent III responded with all the measured restraint of a medieval nuclear option. He placed England under interdict in 1208. An interdict was basically the medieval equivalent of putting an entire country in religious timeout. No church services, no weddings, no baptisms, no last rites. Essentially, God had temporarily blocked England on all social media platforms. People couldn't even get properly buried. They had to be dumped in unconsecrated ground like medieval garbage. It was the ultimate passive-aggressive punishment from Rome. But John, displaying the same brilliant decision-making skills that had lost him half of France, decided to double down. He confiscated church property, exiled bishops who supported the Pope, and basically turned England into a theological rogue state. His subjects were watching their souls get repoed while their king played chicken with the Vatican. Talk about poor customer service. The Pope's next move was even more devastating. He excommunicated John personally in 1209. This meant that according to medieval belief, John's soul was basically getting express delivery to hell. No stops, no transfers. Even worse, the Pope released all of John's subjects from their oaths of loyalty, essentially giving everyone in England a free pass to rebel against their king. By 1213, with French invasion fleets gathering and his own nobles sharpening their pitchforks, John finally realized that maybe picking a fight with God's CO hadn't been his brightest idea. He caved completely, agreeing to make England a papal fief and pay tribute to Rome. John had gone from independent king to the Pope's tenant farmer, which was probably not the character development arc he'd been hoping for. with his military disasters and religious fiascos piling up like medieval credit card debt. John needed money. Lots of it, and fast. His solution was to basically invent creative taxation that would make modern tax collectors weep with admiration. John approached fundraising with the enthusiasm of a medieval loan shark and the ethics of a carnival barker selling snake oil to orphans. First, he cranked up traditional taxes to levels that would make a mafia protection racket blush. Then he got creative. Want to inherit your father's land? Pay John. Want to marry your daughter to someone decent? Pay John. Want to avoid having your property mysteriously confiscated? You guessed it. Pay John. He basically turned being king into a medieval subscription service where opting out meant losing everything you owned. His masterpiece was something called scutage, a tax that let nobles pay money instead of providing military service. This was brilliant in theory. Nobles got to skip war. John got cash. Everyone wins. In practice, John charged scutage rates that would make payday loan companies proud, sometimes demanding it multiple times per year. It was like charging your friends rent for not helping you move, except the friends were armed feudal lords. John also pioneered the art of judicial extortion. Want a fair trial? That'll cost extra. Want the king to actually enforce a court decision in your favor? Premium service fee required. He turned the entire legal system into a medieval vending machine where justice only came out if you inserted enough coins. His courts became less about law and more about who could afford the king's attention. The breaking point came with his demands for funding yet another doomed military campaign in France. After years of paying premium prices to watch their king lose spectacularly, the English barons finally reached their limit. They'd been funding John's failures for over a decade, watching their money disappear into French defeats like medieval venture capitalists backing the wrong startup. By 1215, John's financial creativity had achieved something remarkable. He'd united virtually every important person in England against him. Nobles, merchants, and clergy all agreed on one thing. Their king had become a very expensive liability. They started gathering in secret, comparing notes on John's latest taxation innovations, and probably wondering if regicide was tax-deductible under medieval law. The result of all this discontent was a little document that would become famous far beyond anything John ever accomplished: Magna Carta. Picture this scene: dozens of heavily armed, thoroughly pissed-off nobles cornering their king in a field at Runnymede, basically holding the medieval equivalent of an intervention. John, we need to talk about your spending problem, and your murdering problem, and your general existence problem. Magna Carta wasn't some enlightened manifesto about human rights. It was basically a medieval restraining order against royal abuse. The barons weren't championing democracy. They were trying to stop John from bankrupting and terrorizing them into submission. It was less, all men are created equal, and more, seriously, stop stealing our stuff and murdering our relatives without due process. The document's most famous clause, that justice couldn't be sold, delayed, or denied, was aimed directly at John's judicial vending machine system. They literally had to write down, "The king can't charge people for basic legal rights," because apparently that wasn't obvious to everyone involved. It was like having to explicitly tell your roommate not to eat your food and then make them sign a lease agreement about it. John signed the thing on June 15th, 1215, probably while mentally composing his resignation letter to the kingship. But here's the medieval plot twist. He had no intention of actually following any of it. John treated Magna Carta like a bad Yelp review, something annoying he had to deal with temporarily before getting back to business as usual. Within weeks, he was asking the Pope to annul the whole thing. The barons, who apparently knew their king pretty well by this point, had included enforcement mechanisms in the charter. They created a committee of 25 nobles who could legally rebel if John broke his promises. This was essentially institutionalized revolution. They'd given themselves a constitutional right to overthrow their own king if he misbehaved. Talk about planning ahead. John's response to this constitutional innovation was predictably mature. He immediately started another civil war. Because apparently what England really needed after years of military defeats, religious conflicts, and financial extortion was a good old-fashioned domestic uprising. John was about to discover that fighting your own nobles on your own turf was even more challenging than losing to the French abroad. And so we arrive at the grand finale of John's spectacular reign: death by diarrhea while fleeing his own subjects. In October 1216, John was racing around eastern England like a medieval Uber driver with a 1-star rating, desperately trying to stay ahead of rebel armies who'd finally had enough of his nonsense. He was literally running for his life from people who used to be his own supporters. The irony is delicious. A king who'd spent his entire reign screwing over everyone finally got screwed by his own digestive system. Somewhere near King's Lynn, John contracted what medieval chroniclers delicately called a flux of the bowels, which is basically the medieval equivalent of saying someone got taken out by explosive food poisoning. His body decided to stage its own personal revolt, just as his kingdom was doing the same. Picture this: the man who terrorized nobles with arbitrary taxes, murdered his own nephew, lost half an empire, and picked fights with God himself was ultimately defeated by bad seafood. Some historians think he ate contaminated lampreys, medieval eel-like fish. Others blame peaches, but honestly, after a lifetime of poor decision-making, his stomach probably just gave up in protest. John spent his final days literally running to the bathroom while also running from rebellion, which creates a mental image that would make even his enemies feel slightly sorry for him. He died at Newark Castle on October 19th, 1216, probably wondering how someone who'd inherited an empire ended up dying on the toilet while his own people celebrated in the streets outside. The timing was perfect in its medieval irony. John died just as French Prince Louis was sailing across the Channel with an invasion force, invited by John's own barons who preferred foreign conquest to their native king. England was so done with John that they'd rather be ruled by France than deal with another day of his leadership. That's some next-level unpopularity. But here's the ultimate historical joke: John's death actually saved his dynasty. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, inherited the throne, and suddenly everyone felt bad about rebelling against a child. The barons made peace, the French went home, and the Plantagenet dynasty continued for another 250 years. John's greatest contribution to English history might have been dying at exactly the right moment to prevent total dynastic collapse. Even in death, he managed to accidentally stumble into success, though he was too dead to appreciate the irony. Would a medieval king survive 5 minutes in today's world of social media, 24-hour news cycles, and actual accountability? John couldn't even handle 13th century oversight without dying of stress-induced bowel failure. Imagine trying to explain losing Normandy on Twitter.